The black iron gates loomed ahead, tall and motionless, like guardians of silence. Elias Rowe stood before them, wearing a faded military uniform that bore the weight of memories rather than medals. His back was straight, his prosthetic leg steady beneath him, and in his right hand, trembling only slightly, he held his cap. His other shoulder bore a patch, stitched unevenly, lovingly, with the name Margaret. It was the last thing his wife had sewn before the cancer took her, and he hadn't let a single thread unravel since. The morning breeze tugged at his coat as if trying to remind him that time moved on even when hearts did not. But Elias wasn't here to chase time. He was here to fulfill a promise. A young soldier with a clipboard and mirrored sunglasses stepped forward, his tone clipped, detached, mechanical. "You're not on the list, sir. This is a closed service. Only pre-cleared family members and official personnel may enter." He barely looked up as he spoke, his attention fixed more on procedure than presence. "I am family," Elias said. His voice was low, firm, the voice of a man who had spoken to death before and never raised his tone unless the moment truly called for it. "My name is Elias Rowe. I'm here for the funeral of Sergeant Michael Rowe. He was my son." The soldier paused for a moment, then tapped at the screen on his tablet. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no immediate kin listed under that name. Do you have identification?" Elias reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a battered ID card, laminated but cracked with age. It was the kind issued decades ago, the kind no one scanned anymore. The photo on it was younger, but unmistakably him. The soldier squinted at it, then shook his head. "This isn't valid anymore. Do you have anything else?" Elias shook his head once. "That was all I brought. I didn't come to prove I loved him. I just came to say goodbye." The soldier looked uneasy for a breath but recovered quickly. "I'm sorry, sir. Orders are orders." Elias stepped back a few feet from the gate, replacing his cap slowly, with a grace learned long ago. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stood, just outside the boundary, boots aligned, eyes focused on the flag flapping in the wind over the funeral canopy in the distance. He'd seen that kind of canopy before, many times, in many countries, but this was the first time it held the remains of his only son. Cars rolled past. Officers in dress blues walked by, some nodding politely to others, none to him. A few family members flashed their passes and were ushered in. One or two gave Elias a brief, puzzled glance, perhaps sensing something out of place, but no one stopped. Cameras clicked. Photographers angled their lenses away from him, uninterested in the old man by the gate. He remained still. His leg ached, not from the cold but from the years. His mind wandered back to the day Michael enlisted. 19, straight-backed, his mother crying on the porch as he saluted his father before boarding the bus. "Make me proud, Dad," he'd said. Elias had responded with nothing more than a nod. That was how men like him spoke, through posture, through silence, through being there when it counted. He'd hoped that day would never lead to this one. The last letter Michael sent from the desert had been brief, but one sentence stuck in Elias's heart like a knife left halfway in. "If something happens, I hope you're waiting for me when I come home." Elias wasn't sure what he'd expected when the flag-draped box arrived. There had been calls, condolences, folded paperwork. They'd said Michael died a hero. A roadside explosion. He'd saved 3 others. And now, buried with honors, surrounded by dignitaries who never knew the boy that used to climb trees or leave peanut butter fingerprints on the kitchen door. And yet here Elias stood, uninvited to his own son's goodbye. A group of younger soldiers passed by the outer fence, laughing, tossing a can of energy drink between them. One glanced over and smirked. "Hey, who let Grandpa out of the museum?" The others chuckled. Another pointed at the patch on Elias's shoulder. "What is that, some kind of tribute? Looks like it came from a pillow." Elias didn't answer. He didn't move. He simply shifted his weight slightly, placed his flesh hand over the patch, and continued looking straight ahead. The group wandered off, their laughter fading with the breeze. One of them imitated a stiff-legged walk before vanishing behind the gate. Inside, the ceremony was beginning. The sound of the national anthem drifted on the wind, a distant echo that reached into Elias's bones. His spine straightened instinctively. It didn't matter that no one was watching. That song always made him stand taller. Flags fluttered. Orders barked through microphones. The sound of synchronized boots turning on concrete rippled through the air like memory. And still he stood. A captain from inside the gate paused at a distance, his eyes landing on Elias. He said nothing, but something in his stance changed. He watched as the old man raised his hand again to the patch, then lowered it slowly, deliberately. The wind picked up, and the sun began its slow climb over the field. Elias remained where he was, unmoving, unwelcomed, and unwilling to walk away. Because his son was in there. And he would not be alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sun had risen higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel path behind him. Elias Rowe remained still. His right leg, artificial and dull beneath the fabric of his pressed pants, throbbed with each passing minute. But the pain was familiar. It was not what held him there. What anchored him was the memory stitched into the very threads of the uniform he wore. The jacket had once been midnight blue, crisp and proud, but now it had softened with age, dulled by time and wear. The brass buttons, though polished that morning with trembling fingers, no longer gleamed as they used to. His shoulders sagged a little more now, but his presence still carried something that made those who looked closely straighten without knowing why. He touched the patch again. Margaret, it read in slanted thread, each letter uneven, some tighter than others, a little crooked at the edges. She had sewn it for him one night after his return from Iraq, after the injury, when nightmares still shook his sleep and he rarely spoke unless spoken to. She hadn't said much. Just sat beside him with the coat on her lap, threading needle after needle in silence, her hand brushing against his occasionally, steadying his breath. He hadn't asked for it. She had simply done it, like she always did, with grace and quiet love. And now she was gone too. The cancer had taken her swiftly, but not before she made him promise he would watch over Michael the way he once watched over his platoon. Michael had been 17 when he first asked about enlisting. Elias hadn't answered immediately. Instead, he had taken his son out back, to the shed, opened a dusty trunk and pulled out an old photo, his own squad, arms draped over shoulders, dirt on their faces, but pride in their eyes. He had said, "Don't wear the uniform unless you know what it costs." Michael had stared at that photo for a long time before saying quietly, "That's why I want to." Now that same cost had come due. As Elias stood by the gate, watching people stroll past in polished shoes and tailored uniforms, his mind drifted back to the day Margaret died. Michael had flown home for 2 days to sit beside her bed. He didn't cry until she was gone. Then he folded the same patch his mother had made, placed it in a box, and told Elias, "Take care of it. It's part of both of you now." Elias had stitched it back on his coat the day Michael left for his final deployment. That was the last time they had embraced. Voices stirred to his left, laughter again, younger men in their 20s with fresh haircuts and energy drinks in hand. One of them glanced his way and whispered something to the others. Another burst into a short laugh. They looked like children in borrowed honor, the kind who hadn't yet learned to see the stories in a man's silence. One of them stepped closer, pointing with 2 fingers at Elias's shoulder. "Is that a memorial patch or something?" he asked with a grin. "Looks like something out of Grandma's sewing basket." Elias turned his head slowly, locking eyes with the boy. His gaze wasn't sharp, but it held depth, the kind of stillness that made noise uncomfortable. The young man faltered. He dropped his hand and stepped back. No one else said anything. The others began to drift off, muttering things that trailed off into the wind. Elias returned his gaze to the canopy beyond the fence. He thought again of Michael's last voice message. "Don't worry about me, Dad. I'm watching out for my guys. You taught me well." There had been pride in his voice, and a calmness that made Elias clutch the phone for hours after listening, unsure whether to be proud or terrified. Inside the funeral area, the music had changed. A slow hymn now floated through the speakers, the kind used only for fallen soldiers, the kind that made you close your eyes even if you didn't know the words. Elias stood straighter. His hand brushed over his jacket, checking the crease like he used to when reporting to formation. His left hand, flesh, touched the name Margaret, while his right, cold and metal, remained tucked behind his back. A little girl walked past with her mother, both in black. She glanced at Elias, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity, then whispered something to her mother, who gently tugged her forward. Elias watched them disappear behind the gates. He wondered if she'd ever know someone like Michael had died for children like her to walk freely without fear. A drop of sweat rolled down the back of his neck. It was getting warmer. Still he didn't sit. The aches in his leg reminded him of Basra, of the roadside ambush, of the blood. It wasn't his own blood he remembered most, but the way the sand soaked it up like it had been waiting. That was the day he dragged 2 men out of a burning Humvee. One of them was a young radio operator, Doyle. He hadn't seen him since that day. Had no idea what became of him. He adjusted his coat again. No one had noticed the old man standing there for almost an hour. Or perhaps they noticed and didn't care. He was used to being unseen. But Michael wasn't supposed to be. His boy had earned this day. The sun edged a little higher. The ceremony inside was beginning. Rows of officers stood at attention, the color guard lifted their flags, and voices read solemn words over a microphone. Elias couldn't hear them all, but he heard enough to know his son's name was finally spoken aloud. He closed his eyes briefly, not to shut out the world but to see Michael more clearly. The boy who used to sneak cookies when Margaret wasn't looking, the teenager who could never quite get his tie right, the man who walked away with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a promise to return. Elias opened his eyes and stared at the flag waving above the canopy. The world could shut him out. The ceremony could proceed without him. But nothing would stop him from honoring his son. Not a clipboard. Not a gate. Not even time itself. He remained, unshaken, because he knew something the rest of them had forgotten. That uniform might be old. That patch might be handmade. But the man who wore it had never stopped serving. The gate remained closed, as if it had been built not just to mark the boundary of a military cemetery, but to divide the past from the present. Elias Rowe stood on the wrong side of that line, surrounded by silence and gravel, while the ritual of honor unfolded in crisp formations beyond the iron bars. From where he stood, he could see the rows of white chairs filling with guests, the gleam of medals on dress uniforms, the polished boots stepping in rhythm across the field. A sea of carefully orchestrated respect, and yet none of it reached him. He was just a few feet away, yet the distance might as well have been miles. The voice in his mind whispered, as it had for weeks, this is not how it was supposed to happen. He touched the worn plastic badge still clipped to his chest. His discharge status, his unit, his full name, all laminated and faded from time. It wasn't digital. It didn't scan. The corners had curled, and the photograph looked like someone else's face. But it was real. It had been real enough when it earned him a Bronze Star, real enough when he used it to enter the VA clinic for his prosthetic fitting, real enough when Michael was a boy and would trace the letters of his father's name with tiny fingers and ask, "Did this make you a hero, Dad?" Elias would always answer, "No. It made me responsible." He approached the young guard again, offering the badge with the same quiet dignity. "I'm only here to honor my son," he said. "Michael Rowe. Staff Sergeant." Killed on deployment 2 weeks ago. I raised him. I taught him to serve. I buried his mother. Now I've come to stand beside him one last time. The guard didn't take the badge. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his tablet. I understand, sir, but this list comes straight from the department. I don't see your name under primary kin. It could be a clerical issue, but without confirmation, we can't let anyone through. I'm sorry. Elias didn't argue. He stepped back, nodded once, and returned to the same square of gravel just beyond the gate. The sun had moved again, casting his shadow longer across the path. Somewhere nearby, a radio squawked with static. Inside, a voice took the podium. The eulogies had begun. Elias recognized the name of the colonel who was speaking. He remembered shaking that man's hand once, long ago, at a training base where Michael had received his airborne wings. But there would be no handshake for him today. Not even a nod. He was invisible now. He adjusted the patch on his shoulder, the name Margaret barely catching the light. She would have been appalled by this. Not for herself, but for their boy. She had always believed in quiet dignity. She cried behind closed doors, prayed when no one was looking, and when she grew too weak to speak, she still found the strength to hold Elias's hand and whisper, "Promise me you'll never let him be forgotten." And Elias had said yes, even though he hadn't known then what that promise would demand. He leaned forward slightly, placing a hand on the gate. The iron was warm from the sun. Through the slats he could see the folded flags on the ceremonial table, the honor guard rehearsing silent movements, rifles polished to a mirror shine. Elias had stood like that once, beside men he'd carried through fire and blood, beneath a sun that burned away fear and illusion. But those funerals had been different. No brass bands. No podiums. Just folded flags, dusty boots, and tears that refused to fall until the plane had taken off again. His grip on the gate tightened. He hadn't come for spectacle. He hadn't come to be recognized. He had come because 34 years ago, when Margaret gave birth to Michael in a cramped hospital room while Elias was deployed overseas, he had sworn to return to that boy and never leave him behind. That promise had defined his life, shaped the choices he made, the way he held his silence, the way he taught Michael how to tie a bootlace, how to carry a fallen brother, how to salute with meaning. The sound of rifle bolts locking in unison snapped him back to the present. The honor guard was preparing for the salute. Elias straightened again, spine pulled tight, legs stiff from standing too long. He didn't move when the first volley fired, breaking the air into 3 sharp echoes. The sound rolled across the hills, a reminder of sacrifice that too often faded with the breeze. Then came the second volley. He didn't flinch. The third volley cracked, and for a moment, everything stopped. Even the birds. A group of younger soldiers returned to the gate, the same ones who had laughed earlier. This time they were quieter, less amused, unsure. One carried a program from the ceremony, another flipped casually through photos on his phone. The tallest among them approached Elias again, his expression uncertain now. "Sir," he said, not with mockery this time but with hesitation, "Michael Rowe. Was he your son?" Elias nodded once. The young soldier looked down at the patch. "Margaret. Was that your wife?" Elias looked into the boy's eyes. Not hard, not soft. Just honest. "She made this for me," he said. The soldier blinked. I didn't realize. "I'm sorry." He stepped back, chastened. The others followed him silently, and none of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The damage had already been done, but the apology, however late, carried its own quiet weight. Elias moved slowly toward a low stone ledge along the wall and sat down. The movement was deliberate, measured. His legs ached. His breath came slower now. He placed his cap beside him and reached up once more to the patch, unclipping it gently from his sleeve. He smoothed it flat in his lap, pressing out the creases, tracing each crooked stitch with reverent fingers. No one noticed. No cameras caught the moment. No speaker paused to acknowledge the man outside the gate. But one officer saw it all. A captain near the gate, dressed in formal uniform, watched Elias with eyes that understood. He didn't interrupt. He didn't salute. He simply turned and walked toward the command tent, his footsteps deliberate, his expression unreadable. Elias sat, still and steady, the patch folded over his heart, held in his flesh hand as though it were something alive. The breeze stirred the trees overhead. Inside, the voice of the chaplain lifted in prayer. And just outside the bars, Elias whispered one word to the wind. Michael. Captain Nathan Hale hadn't intended to stop. He'd been on his way to the command tent, double-checking the honor sequence and reviewing the eulogy speech order, but something about the figure at the gate caught his eye. He slowed as he approached the black iron fence, watching the man seated just beyond it, an old soldier in a worn but immaculately kept uniform, his hat resting beside him, his hand clutched over something folded at his chest. The captain had been around enough real men to recognize the difference between a protest and a promise. And this wasn't a protest. It was something deeper, quieter, heavier. It was the kind of silence that said more than any speech ever could. Captain Hale had been raised on stories like this, stories his grandfather used to tell about veterans who returned home changed, stories of bonds formed in fire and loss. But nothing he'd read in manuals or learned at the academy could explain the expression on the old man's face. It was still and patient, yes, but beneath it was a sorrow so personal, so sharp, it didn't need an audience to be real. Hale took a step closer, just enough to see the patch held in the man's hand. It was small, off-center, with slightly crooked letters. Margaret. The name was stitched in faded thread, the kind that frays at the edges with time and touch. The man wasn't just holding a memory, he was holding someone's soul. Something told Hale not to interrupt, not yet. So he stood silently, letting the distance between them speak. The wind pushed at the flags above the canopy, sending ripples of red, white, and blue across the field. Hale turned briefly to look at the honor guard rehearsing near the altar, the folded flag being prepared for presentation, the precise coordination of it all. Everything in the ceremony was calculated, timing, spacing, salute angles, rifle volleys. And yet, standing at that gate, Captain Hale felt like all of it had missed something vital. That man outside wasn't an outsider. He was the center of something no one else could see. Hale glanced at the list clipped to his tablet. Michael Rowe. 28. Killed in action during an extraction op in northern Syria. Survived by a half-sister on his mother's side and a grandmother. No father listed. No spouse. Hale frowned. It didn't make sense. That man didn't just know Michael, he mourned him with the weight of someone who had once carried him on his shoulders. Hale's instincts told him the omission was either bureaucratic oversight or something worse, the kind of mistake people don't notice until it's too late. He turned to one of the junior officers standing nearby. "Who's that man at the gate?" The officer shrugged. "Just some old guy. Tried to get in earlier. No clearance. Didn't make the list." Hale narrowed his eyes. "Did he say who he was?" "Yeah. Claimed to be Michael Rowe's father or something. No documentation. The badge he had was ancient. Didn't scan. Protocol says no entry." The tone was dismissive, too quick, like a report rather than a reflection. Hale didn't respond. He just kept watching the man on the other side of the fence. The man hadn't moved. He was still seated, hand resting over the patch, back straight despite the pain Hale could see etched in his shoulders. His coat had shifted just enough for Hale to glimpse the gleam of prosthetic metal beneath the pant leg. And then he saw it, the man leaning forward slightly, whispering a single word that Hale couldn't hear but somehow understood. Michael. The name struck like a bell inside him. Hale turned away, heading for the command tent with firm steps. He pushed past the perimeter, his mind already rewriting the plan. He wasn't sure what he'd do yet, but something told him he had to speak with the general. Not through the comms. Not through paperwork. Directly. The general needed to know what was unfolding at the edge of his ceremony. Inside the tent, the air was cooler but filled with tension. Officers moved with purpose. Decorations were checked. Speeches reviewed. Aides whispered updates in clipped tones. General Christopher Doyle stood at the center of it all, reviewing the urn transfer sequence with an assistant. Hale paused a moment, uncertain how to approach. He knew Doyle didn't like interruptions. But he also knew Doyle wasn't a man who ignored the truth. He stepped forward, removed his hat, and cleared his throat softly. Doyle looked up, his expression sharpened not with impatience, but readiness. "Captain." "Sir," Hale began carefully, "there's someone outside. I think you'll want to see him." Doyle's brow furrowed. "Who?" Hale hesitated. "He said his name is Elias Rowe. He claims to be Sergeant Michael Rowe's father." Doyle's breath caught slightly. The pause was almost imperceptible, but Hale saw it. A flicker of recognition passed through the general's eyes, followed by something deeper, memory, maybe guilt, maybe awe. "Elias Rowe." Doyle repeated, more to himself than to Hale. "Yes, sir." Doyle closed the binder he'd been reviewing, handed it wordlessly to his aide, and slowly removed his white gloves. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't demand verification. He simply turned and walked past Hale, out of the tent, with quiet urgency. The ceremony outside paused as people turned to look, unsure why the highest-ranking officer present was suddenly leaving his position. The color guard froze mid-step. Cameras pivoted. Murmurs spread like wind through tall grass. But Hale didn't watch them. He turned to look back toward the gate. And when he saw Elias Rowe still seated, still steady, still holding on to that simple, crooked patch like it was a beating heart, he understood something with absolute clarity. This funeral wasn't about medals or ranks or speeches. It was about a promise that had traveled across decades and deserts and lost to arrive at that fence. And now, finally, it was time to open the gate. The wind had picked up again, gentle but insistent, brushing through the trees like a spirit not yet ready to rest. Elias Rowe closed his eyes for a moment and let it pass over him, ruffling the thin strands of gray that peeked beneath his cap. It whispered like Margaret used to when she walked barefoot across the kitchen floor in the mornings, coffee in hand, her voice low so as not to wake Michael. That sound, the soft swish of her dress, the tap of her fingers against a mug, the hum of a hymn she never remembered the words to, was a memory that clung to him more tightly than any battlefield roar. And now, as he sat alone beside the cemetery wall, it was the wind that brought her back to him. He pressed the patch closer to his chest. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of what it carried. Each stitch held a moment, Margaret laughing as she unspooled thread, Michael tugging at his father's sleeve to show off his first paper badge, the night before deployment when they had all stood in the hallway saying goodbye but not really knowing how. It wasn't just fabric. It was all that remained of everything they were. The breeze shifted again, this time lifting the hem of his coat just enough to reveal the polished edge of his prosthetic. Elias glanced down and sighed. He remembered the moment that leg had become metal. Basra, 1991. The ground had exploded beneath his unit during an extraction. A young radio operator had gone down, bleeding out fast, tangled in comms wire and sand. Elias had crawled back through fire to reach him, dragging him out just as a second mortar hit. His own leg hadn't made it. But the kid had lived. And somehow, Elias never regretted the trade. When he received the prosthetic, Margaret had been furious. Not at him, but at the world. She cursed quietly as she helped him into his new brace for the first time, her eyes full of sorrow she tried to hide. That night, when he couldn't sleep, She lay beside him and whispered, "You gave part of yourself so someone else could go home. But promise me, don't let the rest of you disappear." He had nodded, unsure then what that meant. Now, sitting outside his own son's funeral, he finally understood. This was the rest of him. This was what had remained, because it had a job to finish. Inside, he could hear the chaplain's voice, steady and solemn, offering scripture and final rites. Every word passed through the air like a breath he couldn't quite catch. He pictured Michael lying there, his body not in a casket but reduced to ashes, light and silent, carried in an urn he had never imagined lifting. Elias had always thought he'd go first. He'd planned for it. Margaret's grave already had a space beside it. But fate, war, and duty didn't consult blueprints. The memory of Michael's last call played again in his head. It had come at dusk, just as the porch light flickered on. Michael's voice had been strong, but there was something in it, an edge, a knowing. "Dad, if something happens, don't let them forget who I was. Not the uniform. Me." Elias had said he wouldn't. He had meant it. But now, here he was, sitting alone outside the gates while strangers folded his boy's flag and read prepared words that couldn't begin to describe the child he'd raised. He looked across the grass, toward the canopy where the ceremony was reaching its climax. The rifle team had reset their stance. A folded flag was being carried with reverence across the platform. Men in brass and ribbons watched with solemn respect. Elias remained still, not out of obedience, but because it was the only thing left he could control. He didn't need to be inside to say goodbye. He didn't need a front row seat. He needed to stand the way Michael would have wanted him to, present, unshaken, faithful. The ache in his leg pulsed, dull and rhythmic. He shifted his weight carefully, straightening the crease along his trousers, brushing the dust from the edge of his shoe. There was no audience for it, but he knew Margaret would have noticed. She always insisted on clean lines, even in grief. He chuckled under his breath. She would have yelled at these young guards for not letting him in. She would have walked through that gate herself, protocol be damned. He sat back against the stone and felt the rough texture press into his spine. The sound of music had begun again. Taps would come next. And then silence. That final silence that no speech or trumpet could follow. He took in the air slowly, filled his lungs, then exhaled with care. In the stillness, he imagined Michael's smile, the one that appeared just before he said something inappropriate. Elias remembered it vividly, the way it would curl sideways and pull light into a room. He missed that more than anything. The weight of that missing smile hurt more than the loss of a limb ever had. A figure in uniform passed by on the inside of the fence. Young, focused, clipboard in hand. He didn't stop. Didn't look. Elias didn't blame him. The world had grown fast and efficient. It had little time for old soldiers who carried more memory than muscle. But what it didn't understand was that men like Elias didn't show up for ceremonies. They showed up for promises. He looked down at the folded patch again, pressed it to his lips, then to his chest. He could almost hear Margaret humming. Somewhere in the sky above the field, a hawk circled lazily, wings outstretched, gliding in the soft currents that no one below could see. It reminded him of something Michael once said as a boy when watching birds on a family hike. "They don't fight the wind, Dad. They ride it." Elias smiled faintly. Maybe today, he was the wind. Maybe today, his presence, uninvited, unannounced, was the current that carried something higher. And though no one knew it yet, the gate would not stay closed much longer. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? General Christopher Doyle stood behind the command tent's canvas flap, shoulders squared, eyes on the quiet procession unfolding just beyond the edge of the memorial field. He had given dozens of eulogies in his career, signed off on hundreds of funeral protocols, and stood at attention beside more caskets than he dared count. But something about this one tugged at him differently. It wasn't the press presence or the line of dignitaries waiting to offer hollow condolences. It was something he couldn't quite name, until Captain Hale appeared beside him, face tense, voice low. "There's someone outside, sir," Hale said. "You'll want to see him." Doyle barely turned. "Someone?" he asked, half distracted by a clipboard in his hand. "Elias Rowe, sir," Hale answered. "He says he's Michael Rowe's father." Doyle froze. The name hit him like a round to the chest. For a moment, the ceremony faded, the whispers of officers, the click of rifles being checked, the choir warming up behind the canopy. It all disappeared. In its place came a memory, thick desert air, gunfire, and the metallic taste of adrenaline. Basra. That impossible day. Doyle had been a young corporal then, panicked, radio cable twisted around his legs, blood slicking the ground beneath him. He remembered seeing fire in the sky, hearing his own scream, and then, Elias. Tall, silent, bleeding from his thigh, dragging him out from beneath the wreckage like he weighed nothing at all. Elias hadn't spoken that day, not more than a single curse and a grunt. But Doyle had looked up at him, dazed, and whispered, "Why'd you come back?" And Elias had said, "Because she told me never to leave anyone behind." He had never forgotten that. Never. He dropped the clipboard, unfastened his ceremonial gloves with practiced fingers, and handed them to the aide beside him without explanation. "Where is he?" Doyle asked, already walking. "Outside the gate," Hale said. "Been there since before the ceremony started. They didn't let him in. Not on the list." Doyle said nothing, but the heat in his steps answered every question. The moment he stepped out of the tent, the air shifted. People turned. A colonel lowered his phone, confused. The bandmaster stopped mid-gesture. Everyone knew General Doyle did not deviate from schedule, not during funerals, not during ceremony. But there he was, walking briskly away from the podium, away from the family section, away from the tightly scripted order of honors, straight toward the edge of the cemetery. Elias saw him coming and didn't move. He sat upright, hands resting on his thighs, patch folded at his chest. He didn't blink. He didn't stand. He simply watched. Doyle stopped just inches from the gate. The two men looked at each other through black iron, not as strangers, not even as equals, but as survivors of a time that neither had ever fully left behind. Doyle spoke first, voice lower than the wind. "I heard you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't," Elias answered without hesitation. Doyle exhaled. "He made me promise. Said if you showed up, it had to be you." "Had to be me for what?" Elias asked, but something in him already knew. Doyle turned to gesture behind him. A young sergeant stepped forward, carefully holding a wooden box polished to a deep mahogany shine. The urn. Inside it, what remained of Michael Rowe. The young man who once ran across the backyard with scraped knees and a popsicle. The soldier who followed his father's footsteps into service, and then beyond them, into death. He wrote it in his final directive, Doyle said. No one else was to carry him. Only you. Elias didn't move for a moment. His hand twitched. The air around him seemed to pull tighter. Then he stood, slowly, carefully, brushing dust from his pant leg, rebut-toning the front of his coat. When Doyle offered the urn, Elias took it with both hands, and suddenly the tremor in his fingers wasn't from age or injury. It was from weight. Not the weight of the urn itself, but the promise it represented. The burden of love. The fulfillment of duty. The cemetery went still. Inside the canopy, the color guard turned in unison, unsure what was happening. The priest looked toward the commotion. The band lowered their instruments. Someone in the press lowered a camera. No one moved, because no one had ever seen a 4-star general leave a ceremony midstream and hand the fallen to a man who hadn't even been let past the gate. Elias stepped forward, urn held at chest height, arms firm. Doyle opened the gate. No one stopped him. No one could. The two men, one wrapped in ribbons, the other in rusted thread and memory, walked side by side down the central path. The guests stood. Some saluted. Others simply removed their hats. The sound of chairs scraping back in reverence rose gently, like the stirring of a hymn. Elias didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just walked, each step steady and true. He didn't look left or right. The urn didn't tremble in his grasp. This was not a burden. It was a march. One final mission. One last act of fatherhood. Doyle leaned closer as they passed beneath the flag canopy. I was there, Elias. Basra. I was the second radio operator. You pulled me out too. Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight in his arms said everything. They approached the platform where the folded flag waited. Elias ascended the steps alone, turned slowly, and placed the urn above the flag. His hand lingered on it for a moment, then withdrew. He removed his cap, pressed it to his heart, and stood at attention, not because someone called the order, but because the man who lay inside that box had once called him, Dad. In the stillness, no one moved. No applause. No anthem. Just a silence so full it felt sacred. A stillness no protocol had prepared for. A moment not found in any official schedule, but one that would echo longer than any speech. Elias Rowe stood motionless at the platform, the urn resting before him like a final altar, the folded flag just beneath it bearing all the weight of a life lived in service and lost too soon. His cap was tucked under his left arm, and his hand, flesh, veined, strong despite the years, rested lightly over his heart. The sun filtered through a passing cloud, casting a hush over the field that no bugle could summon. Around him, the assembly remained standing, their earlier confusion replaced with reverent stillness. Elias didn't seek their attention. He didn't need it. His purpose was clear, private, and eternal. General Doyle stood just behind him, silent as a sentry. He made no move to take the urn back, made no effort to reclaim the ceremony. He understood, without needing explanation, that the moment now belonged to Elias and the son he had raised, buried, and carried, not in his arms alone, but in every word he never said and every mile he had walked to be here. Elias turned slowly toward the crowd. Faces stared back, officers, family, dignitaries, young soldiers in their first dress uniforms. Some had tears in their eyes, though they didn't know exactly why. They weren't just witnessing a funeral. They were witnessing something far rarer. A man without ceremony becoming the most honorable presence in the entire field. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the ache in his leg familiar but manageable, and raised his right arm in a salute. The movement wasn't fluid. His prosthetic shoulder made it stiff, a shadow of the sharp, proud motion he once executed as second nature. But the salute, though imperfect in form, was flawless in meaning. It rose slow, steady, unwavering, hand open, palm angled just right. It was a salute not just to the flag, or to the general standing behind him, or even to the soldiers surrounding the platform. It was to Michael. To a promise kept. To a bond that neither time nor war nor death could sever. The effect was immediate. Those closest to the platform, young enlisted men, junior officers, even civilian guests, began to lift their hands in response. It started as a ripple, spreading slowly but powerfully through the crowd. One by one, they raised their arms. Salutes, hands over hearts, hats removed, eyes fixed not on the flag alone, but on the man who had waited outside the gate simply because no one had known his name. Somewhere near the back, a bugler paused, unsure whether to begin taps or wait. No one gave the cue. It didn't matter. In that moment, there was no need for horns or drums. There was only the sound of respect filling the air like prayer. Elias's hand dropped slowly to his side. He stepped back from the platform, eyes locked on the urn. His lips didn't move, but his expression held something deeper than words. It was the same look he had worn the day he told Michael goodbye before deployment. The same look Margaret had seen when he returned from war, wounded and changed, but still whole in the ways that mattered. As he stepped down from the platform, a whisper moved through the crowd, like wind through wheat fields. They didn't know who he was, but they felt it, that sense of gravity, of witness. He passed by officers who outranked him in title but lowered their eyes in silent acknowledgement. General Doyle followed at his side, not in front and not behind. Just beside. Equal in that sacred pause between rank and reverence. Elias glanced left as they moved through the narrow path between rows of standing soldiers. And there, among them, were the young men from earlier, the ones who had laughed. They stood now, straight as flagpoles, not out of obligation but remorse. Their faces were solemn, their expressions raw. One of them, the tall one who had mocked the patch, took a single step forward. "Sir," he said, barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry." Elias didn't slow. He didn't break stride. But he nodded once, a gesture so slight it could have been missed. And in that nod, the weight of forgiveness landed with quiet force. The apology wasn't for the insult. It was for not knowing. And the nod was not an approval. It was a lesson, that you do not have to understand a man's story to honor his presence. They reached the outer edge of the field again, the black iron gate behind them now wide open. No one tried to close it. No one dared. Doyle turned to Elias and spoke, his voice still low, as if afraid to break the spell. He never wanted glory. Just respect. Elias nodded, his eyes still on the path ahead. He earned it. Doyle swallowed hard, and for a moment, he was no longer a general. He was just a man who had once been pulled from rubble by the father of a boy now turned to ash. "He wouldn't have come home," Doyle said, "if you hadn't saved me. He was born because of you." Elias looked at him then, and in his gaze was not pride, but humility. He had never sought credit. Never wanted thanks. And yet, hearing that Michael's life had been born from a moment of fire and instinct, landed somewhere deep, in the place where sorrow gives way to something like peace. They paused as they reached the stone bench where Elias had waited that morning. His hat still rested there, exactly as he had left it. He picked it up, brushed the dust from its brim, and placed it gently back on his head. Then he turned to face the field one last time. The wind rose again, swirling gently through the trees. The flags flapped overhead. Somewhere far off, the sound of a hawk called out once, twice. Elias raised his eyes and stood at attention, not because someone ordered him to, but because in his heart, the mission was not yet done. And in that silence, his presence became the only sound that mattered. Elias Rowe stepped forward with the urn held firmly in both hands, its polished wood surface catching the morning light in gentle glints. Every eye was on him now, but it didn't matter. This wasn't for them. This was for Michael. This was for Margaret. This was for all the promises whispered in empty kitchens and across sand-blown radio lines. The silence that followed him was not the absence of sound but the presence of reverence. Even the birds seemed to quiet as he moved. No orders were given. No anthem played. The only music was the rustle of uniforms and the slow rhythm of his boots against the gravel path. Doyle walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not leading and not following, just there, like brothers in arms marching through memory instead of time. They passed through the narrow aisle that had once denied him, and now parted like an old sea returning what had been unjustly cast aside. Rows of service members stood at attention. Some saluted with crisp precision. Others simply placed their hands over their hearts. A few elderly veterans in civilian clothes stood shakily, using canes or leaning on family, but they stood nonetheless. One man with a purple heart lapel pin gave a nod so slow and deep it seemed carved out of stone. This wasn't a performance. This was belonging, finally recognized without ceremony or fanfare. Elias felt the urn shift slightly in his grip. It wasn't heavy, not physically. But it carried every missed birthday, every unopened letter, every whispered, "Be safe," that he'd spoken into Margaret's hair when Michael was gone. It carried the weight of knowing that he'd outlived both the woman who taught him gentleness and the boy who taught him faith. And yet, his arms didn't falter. His gait remained sure. He'd learned long ago that grief didn't weaken you, it clarified what mattered. The path ahead stretched longer than it was. Each step felt deliberate, sacred. His left leg moved in time with his memories. His right, mechanical and stiff, echoed faint clicks with each lift and fall, a metronome of loss and endurance. But he didn't slow. Not for the ache in his hip. Not for the sudden blur at the corners of his eyes. Not for the 100 faces watching. He had marched through hell with men screaming beside him. He had carried fallen brothers out of burning wreckage. This walk, though harder in its own quiet way, was the last one he would ever need to make for someone he loved. Ahead, the altar waited. A small raised platform draped in white cloth, framed by the American flag and a single wreath of dark green laurel and white lilies. The folded flag was already in place, tucked with precision on a pedestal, its stripes and stars tucked so tightly it looked more like stone than fabric. It didn't need to move. It had already done its duty. Now it waited to be joined. The younger soldiers from earlier were there too, lined up along the side. Their expressions had changed. The mockery had long since drained from their faces. What was left was something closer to awe, and maybe shame. One of them, the same tall boy who had touched the patch, took a single step forward as Elias neared. His voice was barely audible. "Sir. I'm sorry." Elias didn't stop. His eyes remained forward. But as he passed the young man, he gave the slightest nod. It was enough. The boy straightened and brought his hand to a trembling salute. When Elias reached the altar, he paused. The urn in his arms trembled slightly, not from him, but from the moment itself. He lowered it with infinite care, setting it beside the folded flag. Then he rested one palm atop the lid, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Rest easy, son. I've got you now." He removed his cap and stood at attention once more. The wind moved around him like a breath from the heavens. Doyle came to stand beside him again, not speaking, simply mirroring the silence with dignity. Behind them, the crowd remained standing. No one moved. No one coughed. The stillness was absolute. And then something unexpected happened. A rustle moved through the rows. Veterans began to stand. Men and women who had come in plain clothes, some with service pins, some without, began rising one by one. A woman in a dress uniform with silver hair beneath her beret stood tall, her spine perfectly straight. A man with trembling legs leaned heavily on his cane but rose without assistance. One by one, they came to their feet, scattered across the field, not in uniform formation but in silent unity. A few placed their hands over their hearts. Others gave salutes. No one spoke. But together, they formed a second honor guard, one born not of duty, but of memory. The sun broke through the clouds then, casting a golden warmth over the canopy, over Elias, over the urn that held what was left of Michael Rowe. And in that moment, something shifted. It was as if the whole cemetery leaned in, listening. Not for words. Not for prayers. But for truth. Elias remained standing, his cap at his side, his shoulders straight. He looked up. Not at the people, not at the sky, but at the space between, where spirit lingers and love doesn't end. Doyle turned to him, voice quiet. "We'll finish the service now, if that's all right." Elias nodded once. "Do it right." And Doyle did. The band played softly, the chaplain resumed, and the folded flag remained untouched. It didn't need to move again. The most important part had already happened, not in the speech or the salute, but in the walk. In the man who carried his son not just into the service, but through it, and now, finally, home. As Elias stepped back down from the altar, the field remained hushed. It wasn't over. Not yet. But something had been completed, something no one would forget. The longest walk wasn't measured in distance. It was measured in love. The sun was softer now, filtered through scattered clouds that painted the sky in muted hues of blue and gold. The crowd had begun to disperse slowly, respectfully, as if reluctant to leave what they had just witnessed. There were no announcements, no orders barked, no formal dismissal. It was as though everyone simply understood that something sacred had taken place, something too fragile for applause or commentary. Elias Rowe stood at the edge of the platform, the urn now resting beneath the folded flag, the last of his family laid to rest with the solemn grace only silence can provide. His cap was back on his head, his stance unchanged, but something in his eyes had settled, as if the long, slow storm inside him had finally passed. General Doyle stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the guests drift away across the green field like shadows moving through memory. The flag above them still rippled in the wind, but it no longer seemed like a banner of sorrow. It was a banner of return. Of something fulfilled. Elias turned to Doyle and gave him a nod, not of thanks, but of recognition. There were no words needed between them. Some things, especially between soldiers, are better left unspoken. They began walking again, not toward the parking lot or the ceremonial tents, but toward the far end of the cemetery, where fewer people ventured. It was quieter there, where old oaks stood guard over simple plaques embedded in the grass, their branches stretching like arms to the heavens. Doyle walked slightly behind, unsure of their destination but not questioning it. Elias moved with certainty, his gait slower now, not from age or injury but because what came next could not be rushed. Every step felt like a return, not to a place, but to a moment that had waited patiently for decades. They arrived at a particular tree, tall, weathered, its bark furrowed like the face of an old friend. Beneath it, nestled in the roots and framed by a patch of carefully trimmed grass, was a small bronze plaque. The engraving was fresh, the letters still sharp. In honor of Staff Sergeant Elias Rowe and Margaret Rowe. Because honor is not given, it's carried. Doyle stopped when he saw it, his breath catching for just a second. He hadn't known. Elias had requested it quietly through a friend at the cemetery administration, no ceremony, no unveiling, just a place, simple, silent, sufficient. Margaret had always loved trees. When Michael was a boy, she used to bring him to this very one, sit beneath it with a blanket and read to him until he fell asleep in her lap. She had once said that if anything ever happened to her, she didn't want a marble angel or a stone cross. Just a tree. Something alive. Something that gave shade. Elias stepped forward, lowered himself slowly to one knee, and reached into his coat pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he withdrew the small fabric patch, now worn thin from years of touch. Margaret, it still read, the thread frayed at the edges, one corner curling up like a whisper. He held it in his palm for a moment, then pressed it to his lips. Doyle stood behind him, head bowed, his hat removed and held respectfully at his side. Without fanfare, Elias leaned forward and began to dig into the earth with his bare hand. The soil was soft beneath the tree, dark and rich. It crumbled easily as he made a small hole at the base of the trunk, brushing away roots with reverence. Then, with the care of someone laying down a sacred relic, he placed the patch into the earth and covered it again, pressing the soil gently with his palm. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just sat back, exhaled slowly, and placed his hand over the spot. Doyle knelt beside him, unsure if he should say anything. Finally, in a voice so low it barely stirred the air, he said, "They'll come here." Elias nodded. "They already are." The breeze picked up, rustling the branches above. Leaves shimmered like coins in the light. A pair of birds flew from one limb to another, their wings cutting arcs against the sky. The world did not pause for them, but it felt, for a moment, as if it bowed just slightly. Elias stood with some effort, Doyle offering an arm that was waved off with a quiet shake of the head. He brushed the dirt from his hands and looked one last time at the tree. The years had shaped it into something strong but imperfect. Its trunk leaned slightly to one side. A crack ran up its bark like a scar, and yet it stood tall, proud, unmoved by time. Just like Margaret. Just like what they'd built. He turned from it slowly, his face calm, his steps unhurried. Doyle followed, walking in step with the man who had once carried him from death's doorstep and now had carried something even heavier, his son, his pain, his memory, across a field that had tried to keep him out. They passed by the outer edge of the cemetery where a few guests still lingered. Some recognized him now. They didn't stare. They stood. Without knowing why, without needing to ask. Uniforms faded, but reverence did not. Elias didn't wave. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Every step he took down that gravel path was its own kind of salute. When they reached the final bend before the exit, Doyle paused and asked, "Are you sure you don't want to ride?" Elias glanced at him, a hint of a smile beneath his weathered eyes. "I've walked this far. Might as well finish it right." Doyle smiled too. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, hat in hand, as Elias turned and made his way down the path alone. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. The wind followed him. And from behind, all who watched understood that they had not just seen a father bury his son. They had witnessed a legacy laid into the earth, quietly, humbly, and with unshakable love. The road leading out of the cemetery was narrow, lined with old hedges and crooked fence posts weathered by time and rain. The gravel crunched beneath Elias Rowe's boots as he walked slowly, each step measured not by distance but by memory. There was no fanfare behind him, no applause, no cameras. The ceremony was over. The flags had been folded, the chairs stacked, the rifles returned to their cases. But for Elias, the most sacred part of the day was just now beginning, the part where you leave the place of grief and carry the weight home. A few guests passed him going the other direction, headed to their cars. Some offered nods. Others simply moved aside as he approached, their eyes lowered out of something deeper than courtesy. They didn't know everything. Most of them hadn't even heard his name spoken during the service. But they knew they had witnessed something rare. And in that knowing, they offered the only gesture that mattered, silence. He reached the bend in the path where the tree line parted, revealing a wide view of the cemetery grounds. From here, he could see the canopy in the distance, the altar where the urn still rested, cradled beside the folded flag, waiting to be carried to its final place. But Elias would not return. That part was not his to do. He had already walked the hardest road. As he paused beneath the archway that marked the cemetery's exit, he turned slightly, just enough to see the expanse one last time. The flag at the center pole still flew high. The breeze lifted it, letting it dance for a moment before gently falling again. It reminded him of Michael's laugh, of Margaret's soft humming, of the sound of home before the world changed. He closed his eyes and let the breeze brush his face, the warmth of the sun settling gently on his shoulders. For a brief second, he felt her, Margaret, standing beside him again, not as a memory but as presence. And he felt Michael too, not as a name etched into granite, but as the little boy who once stood on tiptoes to salute the mailbox, who marched through the house in his father's old boots, too big for his feet but just right for his dreams. He opened his eyes slowly, and when he turned to walk away, he did not walk like a man who had been forgotten. He walked like a man who had remembered everything that mattered and left none of it behind. Near the parking area, a small group had gathered. Among them were the young soldiers who had laughed earlier in the day, now quiet, their uniforms slightly wrinkled, their hands clasped behind their backs. One of them, the tall one who had touched the patch, stepped forward. His voice was unsure, but his posture was rigid with sincerity. "Sir," he said, "I wanted to say, we didn't know who you were. We didn't know what you were here for. But we saw what you did. I'll never forget it." Elias regarded him with calm eyes, the kind that had seen too much to be surprised and too much more to judge. He said nothing. But he extended his hand, flesh and bone, strong and weathered. The young man took it, a little too quickly, like someone grabbing hold of something they feared they didn't deserve. Elias gave it one firm shake, then moved on. The gesture was enough. The boy would carry that moment longer than he knew. He reached the edge of the lot where Doyle stood beside a black government vehicle, door open, waiting. Elias slowed but didn't change direction. Doyle raised an eyebrow. "You sure you don't want to ride?" he asked. Elias nodded toward the horizon. "I've walked all this way. The last stretch should be mine too." Doyle nodded. "You did more than enough today." Elias gave a faint smile. "I just showed up. That's what a father does." Doyle didn't argue. He stepped back and raised his hand in a crisp salute. This time, Elias returned it, slower, stiffer, but unmistakably proud. And then he turned once more, walking down the road alone. The further he went, the quieter the world became. His footsteps grew softer, the trees whispered above, and the road curved gently toward a future that had yet to take shape. Somewhere beyond the hills, tomorrow waited. But for now, Elias let the silence speak for him. It said everything no speech could capture. It carried the sound of a promise kept, a legacy honored, and a love that no coffin or urn could ever contain. As he passed a final bend, he reached a small wooden bench under another old tree, this one younger than Margaret's tree but still sturdy. He sat down slowly, his legs grateful for rest, and removed his cap, placing it on his knee. The air smelled like soil and sunlight, of grass freshly cut and flowers left behind by strangers. He reached into his coat and removed nothing. The patch was gone now, resting beneath the roots of a tree that had already begun its silent work of turning sorrow into shade. He folded his hands in his lap and sat still. Not because he had nothing more to do, but because he had done what mattered most. Around him, the breeze continued to move, picking up petals, rustling leaves, reminding the earth that life always carries on, no matter how gently. He stayed there for a long while, saying nothing. And in that sacred stillness, he realized that he didn't need to speak. Not anymore. His silence was not absence. It was presence. The kind that remains long after footsteps fade. When he finally stood and walked again, no one followed. No one called out. But behind him, in the field where a father once stood waiting at the gate, there remained an invisible trail, a path of dignity, of devotion, of love that refuses to be forgotten. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear it move. Because some goodbyes don't echo in sound. They echo in silence. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?